Welcome, everyone, to Getting Started with CMMC, 10 Steps to Compliance. So before we get started, I just want to, first of all, thank both of our guests, Thomas Graham and Stephen Pratt. And if you both could just give us a quick intro, and I'll start with Steve, please. Can you give us just a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Steve Pratt. I'm the CISO for Sentar. I'm also director of our cyber risk and compliance sector, which houses our CMMC, FedRAMP, and StateRAMP work. I'm also a certified CMMC assessor. I have over 2 decades of experience in the IT and cybersecurity field, and have helped over 200 clients prepare for NIST 171 and CMMC assessments. So glad to be here with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're so happy to have you. And Thomas Graham, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm the pizza guy. I know how to order pizza like nobody's business. No, Thomas Graham, Vice President, Chief Information Security Officer for Redspin. Participated in well over 20 joint surveillance assessments to date. I was the chief architect of Redspin, being the first authorized EAO. Prior to working with Redspin, I worked with the DoD in a variety of capacities over the course of pretty much a decade, either as an ISO at the DISA level, or I also headed up the technical mitigation remediation arm for DHA. And I can order pizza.
And you do know how to order pizza, indeed. Thank you, Thomas. And the real quick intro about me, for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Noelle Vestal. I am the Chief Compliance Officer here at PreVeil. I also wanted to mention we're going to have a poll. So there are a couple of questions. We would love to get your answers on these. So the questions are pretty simple. How are you approaching the CMMC? Are you doing this internally? Are you doing it with a managed service provider, hiring a consultant? And then our second question is going to be, what are the biggest challenges that you've had in your journey with CMMC? So we'd love to see all of your responses to that. Awesome. Oh, great. Love this. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started. There's just a couple of slides since we are talking about getting started with CMMC and the 10 steps to compliance. 10 steps to CMMC compliance. Now, this is obviously, if you are not aware, CMMC and NIST 171 does not have any specific steps for where to get started. This is just what we suggest based on the many different customers that we've helped through joint surveillance voluntary assessments and NIST 171 assessments, and et cetera. This is the information that we've gathered over the years of our expertise. We've also had multiple conversations with different certified C3 PAOs, just like Thomas and Stephen. So these are the 10 steps that we recommend. But again, if you have a different steps, don't be scared. It's okay. So we've got the first step, and I'm just going to run through them real quick. Scoping your boundary. That's really, where is your CUI? And we're going to dive into that a little bit more in depth in a moment. And then gain expertise on key concepts in 800-171 and CMMC. If you don't understand it, it's going to be really hard to implement it. Conduct a self-assessment, review what you're actually doing right now, and be very, very honest with yourself as to where you sit currently before you start the implementation of your CMMC journey. And then identify your gaps and categorize them. Which gaps do you have? Which ones do you need to address first or second, et cetera? Prioritize them. And then you want to execute that plan. Update those gaps. Make sure that you're checking all the boxes you need to. And then step 6, document your system. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth in a moment as well. It's a huge part of your CMMC journey. Step 7 is updating your POEM. That's your plan of actions and milestones, and any of your documents. So anything that needs to be updated based on those different updates you made through executing your plan need to be documented, and they need to be documented on your POEMs as well. Step 8 is, do you think you're ready? Is this something where you need to have another self-assessment and really double check yourself? Am I really ready for an assessment? And we also have step 9, which is optional but highly suggested, is having a third-party gap assessment. So that would be having someone come in and do a mock assessment. C3 PAOs are happy to do that. Or you can have a different consultant come in and do a gap assessment and help you identify where those issues are. And then obviously step 10, scheduling your C3 PAO and getting your final assessment. So just a quick overview there on those 10 steps. So now let's dive in a little bit more. So now that we've talked about this sort of at a high level, I'd like to ask Steve, now that we've talked about this, why do you think scoping is so important? And can you highlight where some companies can go wrong when it comes to their scoping of their boundary?
Well, scoping is really what is being assessed. So where are you keeping your CUI? How are you protecting it? How are you controlling the flow of it, where it goes, your people accessing it, et cetera. So if you don't define that scope, then really it can't be assessed. You don't know where that is, what to apply the requirements to. So where we see a lot of companies go wrong, they don't know where their CUI is, or they don't know how to protect the boundaries. They don't know how to set up flow control. They can often misscope those boundaries. There are 4 categories, actually 5, but the 5th one is out of scope assets, but 4 applicable categories in the scoping guidance. And these are your CUI assets, where your CUI is stored, processed, or transmitted. Your security protection assets, those assets that are required, they're in place to provide protection to your scope. And then contractor risk management assets and specialized assets that may reside in those networks, but may not fully either handle CUI or be able to meet those requirements. But all of these need to be categorized and put into place so that you know what you're protecting, you know what to prepare for your assessment, and for your C3PAO to know what they're assessing when they come in.
That makes total sense. That's a great answer. Thank you. And Thomas, just to sort of piggyback on that, why do you think it is that scoping your boundary, for so many different organizations is step 1 of their journey?
Well, because you have to know where your area of engagement is. If you don't know where your area of engagement is, then how do you know what you're putting in place is actually going to cover you there? The other part of that is that in a lot of organizations, and especially, since we've come out of COVID and there's a lot more remote work, folks are coming back into the office to a certain extent, where that data has extended to over the last few years. A lot of folks just may not be aware of where it's at. For instance, maybe they're using their mobile phones and accessing email with CUI in it. Well, now that brings your mobile phones into scope. And under CMMC, you have to identify those authorized devices. And that's something that a lot of organizations are struggling with.
Where could people go, our listeners that are on this session right now, where could they go to get more information about scoping their CMMC boundary?
Well, guess what? There are some brand spanking new, they still have that new document smell, the brand new level 2 scoping guides that were released in conjunction with the 32 CFR rule. You can find those out on the DoD's website. And
for those of you who are not familiar, because I know this is a getting started session, 32 CFR is what is commonly referred to as the CMMC final rule, just to make sure everybody's aware. Thank you, Thomas. That was fantastic. All right. So I think we've talked a pretty good amount about scoping your boundaries. So let's go ahead and move on to something that is a huge concern, I'm sure, for so many people in this session, which is documentation. So what we have here is just an example of some of the documentation you can have, right? Documentation, of course, being probably one of the biggest headaches for a lot of different OSCs, organizations seeking certification that are out there. Thomas, I'm going to start with you. When you're coming into an OSC and you're validating their NIST 800-171 implementation with CMMC level 2, what level of maturity are you looking for in that documentation that you're reviewing?
Just to be specifics from a maturity standpoint, for the most part, maturity has been taken out of CMMC with the revisions over the last few years. However, you're looking, as an assessor, you're looking for the final versions of those documents. You're not looking for draft versions, in process versions. You want to see the final version, because the final version means supposedly it is enforceable. You have the backing of your senior leadership, whoever the signature authority is. That tells us this is the one that is supposed to be followed.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And so when you're in the assessment and you're looking at the different documentation, because you pointed out that maturity is not inherently in CMMC, but what if I just got my CMMC implementation done like a week and a half ago? Is my documentation going to be mature enough for you?
Sure. I want to tell you, the biggest thing, that very first bullet point that you have right there, that system security plan. Please understand, when you're creating your system security plan, it's not an attestation document. It is literally, hey, here's how we do it. Does it have to have all of the details in that document alone? Absolutely not. But it should say and speak to how you are doing things. We as assessors, if you're going through assessment, okay, you're already basically saying, yes, we do these things. We don't need you to tell us again.
So thank you. That was fantastic, Thomas. So Steve, I'll ask you a question. So where do you see in your assessments where those organizations seeking certification, maybe their documentation isn't? We've already discussed that maturity is not necessarily needed, but where are you seeing those issues pop up? Where are those problems for OSCs when it comes to documentation?
At times the documentation is either incomplete or just not not up to date. So the system security plan should tell a story as to how you do things, such as Thomas mentioned. You can put detail in there if you like, but I like the system security plan to be a high level, explaining how you're meeting the requirements, and then using your policies and procedures to go into more detail on how that is done. These should be in alignment. A lot of times we'll see a system security plan that says, we change we require 14 characters in the password, and then your policy and procedure might say you use 12 or require 12 characters. In actuality, when you look at the evidence, they may be requiring 10. So all of these things should match what you're actually doing. We see situations where people buy templates for a system security plan and policies and procedures. Nothing wrong with templates. Those are great to work with, but you need to read those templates. Often you have to tailor them to match your environment, or you have to fill in the blank where there's blanks for it, and you should know what they say. We come in all the time, we see a nice SSP, a nice policy or procedure, and we go through the interview and we're talking to their main person. They say, this is how we do it, and it doesn't match at all what's in their system security plan. And we ask them about that, and then they say, well, yeah, I have no idea that doesn't match what we do at all. And that's a failure for you. You document those defines and those identifies in your documentation, and it should match what you're actually doing.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And just a quick question too, to Thomas real fast. So when you have that documentation and what Stephen was saying, making it very consistent, you're doing what you actually say you're doing. Have you ever seen organizations seeking certification who end up in a situation where their documentation says one thing, but during the interview process, you have employees who are supposed to be trained who are saying something else?
I would say, honestly, in the majority of the assessments we've been a part of, there's been that to a certain degree. One of the very good examples of that is when you're talking about, the password configurations. Your documentation may say, let's say, 12-character password. Well, for the most part, what we've been seeing is folks, their everyday drivers, their Windows systems, their endpoints, that's what they're accounting for a lot of times in their SSPs. But the problem is you also have security protection assets. You also have your external service providers, and you have these other things, even including Linux and Mac OS potentially in scope. With those, a lot of times folks are overlooking those types of systems or the accounts assigned to those types of systems. So they'll put a statement, yes, 12-character password. We get into the interview and talking to, their CISO or head of security or whatever. Is this really how it is? Yes. And then admin's like, well, wait a minute. I don't think we have this on this particular system. Okay. So now what do you have? So yeah, it's very common because most organizations, there's tons of moving pieces, but just have that honest conversation with yourself and, do the checkbox activity. If you're not sure, definitely reach out to folks to help look and have that independent perspective. And that way they may be able to see things that you can't.
Absolutely. And being sure that everybody knows what's going on and everybody is educated about what you actually wrote in your documentation. Yeah, very important. Thank you. That was a perfect anecdote. What I'm going to do now is we're going to dive into step 10. So step 10 is, just as a reminder, the assessment. So if you are unfamiliar with what we're talking about when we say assessment, we're talking about certified third-party assessor organizations like Sentar and Redspin coming in and validating your implementation of the 800-171 controls at level 2. So now that we understand that, okay, great. It's like I've gone through my entire assessment process. I've got all my documentation. I've done a gap assessment. I'm feeling really comfortable about everything. I'm ready to go. Stephen, this is the final step, right? There's nothing else I have to do. Just get an assessment. I'm done. I never have to do CMMC again, right? It's over?
CMMC is ongoing. I mean, you have, you get your certification and then you do continuous monitoring. Your system is going to change. You're going to have periodic requirements. You're going to have to do self-assessments in between your 3-year formal assessments. You're going to have vulnerability scanning. You're going to be doing, you name it. There are tons of continuous monitoring pieces that you have to do to maintain that your documents stay up to date, that your system's up to date, and things that you have to track. And then, as I said, every 3 years, you bring in the C3PAO again to reassess your system.
And when that this is something too that I think a lot of people who are listening right now, like, okay, well, I have to make sure that then in 3 years, I'm ready again, right? Like, I don't have to worry about it right now. I do it, I get it done today. And then like a month before the next time I get an assessment, I can worry about it, right? That's going to work fine, isn't it?
So, as I said, there are things that you have to do periodically, and you should be defining those in your SSP, whether it be weekly, monthly, annually. And we're going to look for evidence that you've been doing those as you say you are. So if you wait till a month before and you say, well, this thing I was supposed to be doing annually, I didn't really do, let me do it really quick. It's not going to suffice because it's not going to match what you say you're doing.
Yeah, that is exactly the issue, right? You want to be sure. And if you take nothing else away from this session, make sure that what you say you're doing is actually what you're doing. That's really, as honesty is the best policy. I know that's an age-old adage, but it's so true with compliance, especially. So thank you. That was perfect, Stephen. So Thomas, since we know that so many companies are going to be needing assessments in the coming months, in the coming years, what's the advice you can give our audience about when they should start engaging with C3PAOs?
I mean, honestly,
yeah,
you should already be engaging with them. The reason being is because I think everybody's fairly aware there's only a limited amount of C3PAs out there. The second thing, though, is there's going to be a ton of organizations that are wanting to reach out and start getting these things. So you need to start talking to C3PAs now, try and identify when you're going to want to go through assessment, try and lock in that date, because ultimately, to a certain extent, it's business decisions. You're going to get pressure from, of course, the government, because it's going to be a contractual requirement once 48 CFR is finalized. However, if you are a sub to a prime on a contract, please keep in mind that primes are not beholden to the phased implementation or the requirements in 48 CFR. We've actually been hearing primes tell their subs, hey, I don't care what data you have. If you're going to be on this contract with me, you've got to be level 2. When are you getting your assessment done? Let me know what your assessment timeline is. I mean, those are kind of the two biggest influences. If you're trying to wait to get in a queue for an assessment, you're doing yourself honestly a very big disservice.
Yeah. And like you said, I think there's less than 60 C3PAOs right now that are out there in the wild, something around that number. It's a very small number, and we've got 80,000 estimated companies that are going to need to get assessed at some point. The simple math is not so simple at that point. You're absolutely right. So, Stephen, if I'm talking to C3PAOs, what are some of the questions or some of those conversations I should be having as an OSC when I'm shopping around for a C3PAO?
Well, you want to start on the Cyber AB marketplace and verify that the company you're talking to is an authorized C3PAO. There are companies out there that are RPOs. They can help you prepare, but you want to make sure you're actually talking to an actual C3PAO. The next thing I would talk about is ask them, what their process is, what their availability is. Availability is going to be the big one. As Thomas mentioned, there are very limited number of us right now. There's thousands of DoD contractors who are going to need this. So you want to know what their lead time, what their availability is. I would ask them what their timeline for becoming, from the point they start to the point they finish, what does that look like? I would look at the number of assessments they performed. Is oddly enough, a question I get a lot of the time is how successful are you, and how many of your clients have passed working with JSVs up until now, have passed. And it's really not up to, I don't think that's really a good indicator of the C3PAO as far as whether they passed or not. That's really more of the OSC themselves. But you want to make sure that they've got experience doing that they've looked at the types of systems you've had before. So that's another question. If they use PreVeil, you want to ask them, have you assessed a company that uses PreVeil before? do you know about it? If you're in an enclave, if you're on the prem, ask what their experience are assessing companies like yours, so that you know that they're going to be able to come in, look at your environment, and accurately assess whether you're meeting requirements.
That makes total sense. And Thomas, it goes back to our very first point, which is scoping your boundary. This is something that I know that I've talked to different C3PAOs about. Do you think it's a good idea if you're an organization seeking certification and you're shopping around for a C3PAO, you're asking all the questions that Stephen was talking about, you're getting the information. Do you also think it's a good idea to actually run the scope of your boundary by your C3PAO and talk to them about, hey, this is my scope. Does that make sense to you?
I mean, to a certain extent it does, because keep in mind that part of the assessment may actually include an on-site portion. So that scoping has to take into account those areas as well, because keep in mind when you're scoping, you're not just talking about technologies, you're also talking about potentially facilities as well as people, because they're included in the level 2 scoping guide. If you have those additional elements, that's something that has to be planned for. It has to be allocated into the assessment. There needs to be a plan in place. There could be additional access requirements that the assessors need when they show up on site. Having that discussion at a cursory level when you're going into an assessment or you're talking to a C3PAO goes back to your point, Noel. I think it was, Noel, be honest. Don't try to sugarcoat things. Don't try to hide things, because if you do, more than likely during the assessment, the assessors are going to find it, and then that's going to require a course correction, which could either add time, additional cost, or both to that assessment process.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So the other question I have actually for both of you is, since we talked about documentation pretty extensively today, what would you both say, and I'll let either of you answer first, what would you both say is the number one most important thing when it comes to documentation?
So for me, the most important thing when it comes to documentation is kind of what I alluded to earlier. Speak to how it is actually being implemented. Keep in mind that, yes, you guys are we'll have to go through assessments, from folks such as myself, from Steve. You, as the organization seeking certification, you have a lot of ability and power to control and direct that assessment. And what I mean by there is, earlier on, we talked about all of the information matching up. If you have traceability from your SSP, your policy and procedure, to your actual configurations, okay, one checkbox. When you point to your policy and procedure documentation, here's an absolutely wonderful pro tip that your assessors will love you to death for. Don't just point to the document. Point to the section in the document. And what that's accomplishing is two things. One, now an assessor doesn't have to go fishing in the documents and maybe see something else. But two, it also makes the assessor's jobs easier, because you're identifying directly where that's going to be, so you're directing where they're going to look.
Absolutely, that's a great tip. That's a great tip. And Stephen, your thoughts. Well, I know we only have a few minutes left, so I'd love to hear your thoughts too. What would you say is like the number one most important item to remember when creating your documentation for CMMC?
Well, I would add to what Thomas said, that you want to look at NIST 171A, which is the assessment guide that has the assessment objectives in there, and format your SSP to align with that. So I have assessed companies before. The SSP had great information that was possibly meeting all the requirements. They pointed to policies and procedures, but they didn't tell me, exactly where, what I'm looking for, 3.1.1 assessment objective A, and I'm having to read to kind of see where are they addressing A,
Right.
If you can put that into your SSP, that makes it a lot easier for us to see, this is the way they believe they're meeting A. Does it? Yes. Move on to the next one. So it takes a lot of the guesswork out of our piece. Very similar to what Thomas was mentioning. If you make it easier on your assessor, they're going to see what you want them to see. You're going to drive them to what you want to see, and maybe not uncover something, different.
That is a fantastic piece of advice for both of you. Truly, you want to make sure that you are telling the story to the assessor, not the assessor stumbling on the story. That's not what you want. So I know that is our time, but I want to say thank you again to both Sentar and Redspin, and to Stephen and to Thomas. Thank you so much for joining.